Frederick Fleet was awfully nervous the night the Titanic sunk into ice-cold water. He was taking over the second shift of the night. The previous lookout said Commander Lightoller had told the crew to keep a sharp eye on the sea for small ice. Officer Lightoller was new to the ship, but he took charge of things well. The previous officer, David Blair, had been excluded from the voyage, and what was worse was that he took with him the keys to the binocular case. Fleet didn't have a pair of binoculars with him, but things had gone well for the first shift. His shift would go by soon as well. He had heard Commander Lightoller promising to purchase binoculars for the lookouts as soon as the Titanic reached New York City. Lightoller commanded the last bridge watch until Officer Murdoch took over. He then ordered to check the ship's freshwater supply for freezing below the waterline, and finally retired to his cabin. After a long day, he was finally off duty now. Fleet kept watching his watch. It was 10 p.m. He stood in the crow's nest, keeping watch until his eye spotted a black mass ahead. In a panic, he struck the bell 3 times and called the bridge. But it seemed like it was too late. The iceberg seemed to be too close. He felt the ship swinging to port as he was still on the phone. The lookouts had their heartbeats raised so high they would almost faint. They watched the iceberg scraping along the side of the ship as ice fell onto the deck. With a relieving sigh, Fleet thought it was only a close call, a near miss. He stood in the crow's nest until he was commanded by Officer Lightoller to help launch Lifeboat 6. Why was Officer Lightoller out? Lightoller had just got into bed when he felt the collision. He ran from his cabin to investigate, but nothing was reported to him. He still felt like something was wrong. He decided to stay awake in his bunk, where other officers could find him just in case of an emergency. And soon enough, one of the officers called him to the bridge. Lightoller was ordered to evacuate women and children first, when he went to launch Lifeboat 2. He saw it was full of 25 men. He screamed at them to get out, and called them all cowards. The lifeboat pulled away with only 17 passengers out of a capacity of 40. He was commanded to launch the lifeboats. Indeed, the RMS Titanic was struck by an iceberg and was rapidly sinking. Some of the officers feared that the lifeboats would sink if they were loaded to their full capacity, but they were unaware that the new davits on the Titanic had been redesigned to hold the full capacity. Under this notion, Lightoller didn't fill the lifeboats to their full. In the meantime, he sent 10 men to open the gangway door in the ship's port, but they never returned to him. They had all drowned while carrying out their final order. The undercapacity boats pulled away from the ship. All except one was full, and that too because the passengers didn't listen to the shouting orders of the officers. The ship was at its last stage. The water came up onto the boat deck, and the clock was ticking. Lightoller attempted to launch Collapsible B on the port side, but that turned out to be a failure and the lifeboat floated off of deck upside down. Was there anything left that he could do? Seawater was washing over the entire ship. He crossed over to the starboard side of the roof. He saw crowds of people running away from the rising water. He felt as if everything was over, and he dived into the water from the roof of the officer's quarter. He tried to swim towards safety when the pressure of the incoming water sucked him under, and he was pinned. Just then, a blast of air from the ship's ventilator blew him to the surface, while the suction pulled him down again. He didn't know how, but he resurfaced once more, and in the distance, he saw the Collapsible B floating upside down with swimmers grasping onto it. He swam to it and took hold of the rope when the Titanic's funnel broke free, sending the Collapsible away from the sinking ship. Lightoller took charge of the boat and organized the 30 survivors there, and he managed to keep the survivors safe through the night when a swell arose. He taught the men to shift their weight with the swells to prevent the boat from being swamped. The passengers kept this up for hours until they were rescued by another lifeboat and then finally by the RMS Carpathia. Who do we remember other than Rose who survived the sinking Titanic? Charles Hebert Lightoller, who was the second officer on board the RMS Titanic. Not only was he a hero on the night of the sinking of the Titanic, but he was among the few survivors. He was born on March 30th, 1874 in Corley, England, but with the death of his mother in his youth and with his father abandoning him, he was left an orphan. At the young age of 13, he decided to start a 4-year apprenticeship at sea, rather than working in a factory like the other kids in England at that time. By the time he was 21, he was regarded as a veteran of the sea, and it was during this time that he left England on a 3-year service with the African Royal Mail. While he was in Africa, he nearly died of malaria and decided to quit his career on sea. In 1898, he went to the Yukon in search of gold during the Klondike Gold Rush. But things didn't go well there, so then he decided to be a cowboy in Alberta. Without any success, he decided to go back to England. However, with no money on him, he earned his passage by working on a cattle boat and arrived back home again in 1899. A year later, he began his career out at sea once again with the White Star Line, and from then on he had a successful 12-year career, until the most famous events in maritime history occurred, the sinking of the Titanic. Lightoller had helped many of the passengers to board the lifeboats, and he himself was fortunate enough to have been one of the survivors. He was the last survivor to be taken on board the RMS Carpathia. After the incident of the Titanic, he returned to duty with White Star Line on the RMS Oceanic, and with the outbreak of the First World War, he served as an officer with the Royal Navy. After the war, he felt he could no longer advance within the line, and resigned. After that, he took up odd jobs, and in 1930s he wrote an autobiography, Titanic and Other Ships. Lightoller died of chronic heart disease on 8 December 1952 at the age of 78. Though Charles Herbert Lightoller had a rather satisfying life with a successful career, another survivor, Frederick, who was the lookout that spotted the iceberg on the Titanic, had a rather depressing and sad life story. He was born in Liverpool on 15 October 1887. His mother had abandoned him and he never knew his father. He grew up shifting from one foster family to another, until he went to sea in 1903 as a deck boy, working up his way to be an able seaman. He had served as a lookout on the RMS Oceanic for 4 years, before boarding the Titanic. On the night of the sinking, Fleet and his fellow crewmen requested for binoculars, but they weren't provided due to many difficulties. The previous officer in charge had been replaced, and he took the keys of the binocular case with him. When the lifeboats were being launched, Lightoller had ordered Fleet to board one as well. He, along with Quartermaster Robert Hitchin, managed the lifeboat until they reached RMS Carpathia at 6 the following morning. After the Titanic incident, Fleet served on Titanic's sister ship RMS Olympic, but he, along with other Titanic survivors, were not treated well by the company, as they kept reminding everyone of the unfortunate event. He left White Star Line, and for the next 24 years, he worked with other shipping companies and served on merchant ships through the First World War. Later, however, he served as a lookout once again on the RMS Olympic. He finally left the sea in 1936, when he was hired by Harland & Wolff to work at the company's shipyard, and later, when he retired, he became a newspaper seller. He was going through a difficult economic time and lived with his wife's brother. In 1964, his wife died and her brother evicted Fleet from his house, which led Fleet into a Great Depression. Subsequently, Fleet committed suicide and hung himself in the house's garden on January 10, 1965. His grave at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton was unmarked until 1933, when the Titanic Historical Society put a headstone on his grave bearing the engraving of the Titanic. Want to be intrigued by the stories of other Titanic survivors? Watch our video on one of the most famous survivor, Violet Jessup, that survived 3 major ship disasters one after the other. And if you liked our video, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification button to get updated of more interesting videos.